This is the Powered Up Podcast, show 153.
Welcome to a real-world education with insight and advice from teachers in the game, where current and former educators reveal what truly sets apart the great teachers and what it takes to make a positive impact on students. Whether you're in pre-service learning, new to the game, or a seasoned veteran, this is the show for you. You'll leave feeling inspired to take action because we are powering education by empowering you.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? This is Ken Ehrman, host of the Powered Up Podcast, and I am here with Matt, Mr. Daddy-O Rogers. Matt, you officially spilled the beans, so I had to give you a dad nickname. I've been chomping at the bit, ready to do it because I'm super excited for you to become a dad. You'll be a fantastic dad. So, how's everything going, man?
Oh, buddy, it's chaos. Absolute chaos. So, as mentioned, I, unlike you, have my first on its way. Baby girl Rogers comes in April. And so that brings all of the adjustments. I'm 36 years old. I wasn't sure we were having kids. It wasn't a lack of interest, but the fact that we are where we're at right now and it's a reality. Like, I almost got really comfortable with my dink lifestyle. Mm-hmm. So some of the changes, and it comes with the holidays. Holidays are always frantic as well, but life is very, very good. How about you?
Life is good, man. Life is very good. I also now chuckle even more when you talk to me about your dog dad problems.
Oh boy.
And just laughing knowing that it's
not quite the same.
You're only looking at the tip of the iceberg when it's compared to human dad problems.
Well, and the shame of this is I'll text Ken being like, "Hey, I have to finish painting the nursery. I'll try to make it on time." And luckily, I've been able to make it most times. But we had a traumatic event with our pup, and we lost a kitty cat last week. So
I usually get those texts as I'm wrestling three kids into their beds.
I believe it.
So we had with us tonight a really, really fantastic guest, Pablo Munoz, who has been involved in education, still is involved in education in really from the top to the bottom, right? Started at the bottom, and by that I mean, started as a teacher like we all do, and worked his way in his hometown district all the way to the top as superintendent, and a longtime successful superintendent. And what I appreciated about the conversation was he provided us the behind the scenes big picture ideas that superintendents typically have to volley on a daily basis and a yearly basis, but also provided details of why and how, and then outlined how it trickled out into what teachers saw on a daily basis. And I thought it was very beneficial for anyone in education to kind of listen to that and have a deeper understanding of what goes on in a district from the top to the bottom.
Yeah, I think we always, and we've had this kind of revelation before, especially when talking with upper admin that have joined us on the show. The tugs and pulls of different people in different positions that you're not currently in are really hard to give value or have perspective of. Like, I know my problems as a teacher right now because that's the world I'm living. And to me, those are my biggest problems. It's kind of like my life problems, right? I'm worried about my dog. You're worried about your 3 kids. There is an uneven balance there naturally. And I think as you move to different positions, whether we would consider it traditionally moving up or down, I think our paraprofessionals, our bus drivers, the maintenance staff, the cafeteria staff, they have pressures. They are as vital in many ways. They don't get nearly as much recognition for it, but we don't always view others in the educational, or we'll say outside education fields, their problems like the ones that we're living in that moment. And so hearing from Pablo just the decisions he brought up a few times, like the outside community as a political component. And I know that a superintendent has to be acknowledging of the surrounding political climate, but like it felt like working hand in hand with the mayor and the elected officials. Where I teach in a rural school district, I mean, we have commissioners, but mainly it's the school board, the superintendent, and the local community manufacturers or business people that kind of provide income for our parents in our local community. It doesn't necessarily feel like it flows back and forth with the political climate as much. And I just found that really interesting that was another tug that he expressed.
I agree. I did find that very interesting as well. So I'd really like not to delay any further, and let's hear from Teach Better and bring Pablo right into our podcast.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. You can find out more at teachbetter.com/podcast. Now let's get back to the episode.
Hi, Pablo. Welcome to the Powered Up Podcast. How you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. Ken and Matt, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So kick us off for us, nice and simple. Just please officially introduce yourself. Let our audience know where you're coming from. And I know you have a really impressive, diverse experience in education. So please give us that background and your connection to education today as well.
Yeah. So I was born, raised, and educated in Elizabeth, New Jersey. For the last 26 years, I've lived in Maplewood, New Jersey, which is not too far from there. Elizabeth is about 16 miles southwest of New York City. And for those of you who fly into Newark International Airport, that airport sits partly on Elizabeth soil. So that's where I grew up. I'm a little bit further away, but not too far in Maplewood. My parents are from Aguada, Puerto Rico. They immigrated here to the United States as teenagers. They came to New Jersey, got married. They had my sister and I. My father has an 8th grade education. My mom has a 6th grade education. My dad worked mostly in the restaurant business. He started out washing dishes, and someone saw promise in him and taught him how to cook. So eventually he became a chef at a banquet hall, serving, lunch and dinner, sometimes breakfast, to thousands of people. It was quite an operation getting out 1,000 meals. I used to see that sometimes. My mom started working in factories, in plastic factories, but eventually she transitioned over to being a seamstress. And I grew up in a house with my maternal grandmother, Cecilia, my mom, my dad, my sister Doris, my aunt Tia Lydia, and my 3 cousins, Carlos, Johnny, and Yvonne. My dad is one of 15, and my mom is one of 5. So I have a whole lot of cousins. Mom and dad and I counted a few weeks ago. We were in the car together, and we were talking about our cousins. We started counting. We ended up getting lost along the way, but we ended up landing at like 70 first cousins. So by the fact that I had so many cousins, actually my circle of friends was largely my family, because we were always traveling to our relatives' homes. The ones that immigrated from Puerto Rico were pretty much in Union County, New Jersey. So it was easy to see them, or we would go to the parks together. I graduated from Elizabeth High School. I played baseball for most of my life. I got my undergraduate degree at Yale University in psychology. And while I was there, I entered the teacher preparation program. So I got my certification to teach in Connecticut, and then I applied in New Jersey when I started working in New Jersey for the certification. I student taught at Wilbur Cross High School in New Haven, Connecticut. And when I was there, I also volunteered as a baseball coach. But I continued being a baseball coach when I started as a teacher, and I continued to coach through the period of time that I was an administrator. And I've coached baseball at all levels, from Little League, coaching my daughters, all the way to professional baseball, where I was a minor league pitching coach for the Chicago Cubs. Got my master's degree at Teachers College, Columbia University, in educational administration. And I began my teaching career back in my hometown of Elizabeth, in the Elizabeth Public Schools. I would eventually get promoted to become the supervisor of social studies, then the director of curriculum instruction, the assistant superintendent, and then in 2005, I became the superintendent of schools in Elizabeth. I did that for about 8.5 years. And then in 2013, I moved to another town, another city in Elizabeth called Passaic. And I was superintendent there for about 7.5 years. And I retired in 2021. And as soon as I did that, I started my educational leadership consulting company. I'm an adjunct professor at Lehigh University in their educational leadership department. And now I'm also an author of a book entitled The Leader's Algorithm. And I'll close my little introduction with what I'm most proud of, and that's my two daughters. Cecilia, she's 22. In June, she graduated from MIT, and she works as a consultant at the Boston Consulting Group. She lives in Boston, but oddly enough, her first assignment is in New York City. So she's actually coming back every week to New York City. It was just the funniest thing. I just got her moved into Boston, and then all of a sudden she's flying back to New York City. So we get to see her a little bit at night when she's not doing some work there. And then my youngest daughter is now first year in college at Boston. She's at Northeastern University. Her full first year is actually in London, and then her sophomore year she'll return to the Boston campus. So actually, my two daughters, when my youngest one is a sophomore, will be pretty close to each other in Boston. So that's who I am. That's where I came from, what I did, and what I'm doing now.
What I love about your introduction is everything that you layered into it, and I say that as a compliment. Talking about your family, talking about where you grew up, the town you grew up in, the school districts you went to, the relationships you had with your cousins, and seeing them, being a part of your friends group, and all of those layers through to say, oh, by the way, I was also superintendent in 2 districts for 15 years. And Matt and I have had many conversations on this podcast with teachers, many of whom were awarded State Teacher of the Year, and a few particular that come to my mind in the way you started this conversation with telling their story to their students, letting students get to know who they are, where they came from, and how their experiences have led them to be the teacher that they are, the way they facilitate classrooms, the way they interact with students, and where that line of vulnerability should rest in a classroom between teachers and students. And Matt has had many conversations on air and off air with me of him becoming more comfortable with that type of vulnerability, and him seeing just in his career how that his perception of that line has changed. And so the fact that you started off this conversation with us, jumping right into that, other than the 10 minutes we had together before we started recording, how much of that story has been a part of who you were as a teacher and who you were as a superintendent, and those stages in between, and even layering in the coaching as well? And how important do you think that was in helping you develop into such a successful teacher and such a successful leader for the school districts?
Yeah, I mean, that's a wonderful question. Certainly in my book, I use a lot of personal and professional examples throughout the book. So as I talk about the leader's algorithm, and then I get into leadership principles, I certainly use a lot of my history. The first story I actually tell in the introduction is a kindergarten story with me and my mom, the kindergarten teacher, which we can explore later if you want. But yeah, listen, when I started teaching at Wilbur Cross, which was a perfect place for me to teach, right? Yale was a little bit different than my hometown. The student body there was different than the urban setting I was used to. But Wilbur Cross in the city of New Haven was very familiar to me, right? The city of New Haven was very much like the city of Elizabeth, the residents and the feel of the community. And then when I student taught at Wilbur Cross, connecting with those students and understanding their story was easy for me because I used to be that first generation immigrant child. So when I went to Elizabeth, I actually used to wear a tie all the time and just a shirt and tie. I didn't have the suit then. I would wear that later on when I became an administrator. But I thought it was important for me to display the fact that I was a Puerto Rican male who had graduated college, and not only college, but a pretty good one for the United States. And then I came back and started teaching. And interesting enough, they ended up putting me initially in the bilingual department, teaching bilingual social studies. So I ended up teaching in Spanish and English to new immigrants, which was really interesting. It was that population of children, although right, they didn't know the English language, and potentially they may have had some disrupted education from their hometown, their home country before they came over. They were a very driven population, right? I mean, you could see in their dedication of doing homework and coming to class, of them thinking that education would lead them to the American dream. At least that's what I sense. I don't know that I ever had that conversation. The reason I bring that up is because I could just juxtaposition that against when I got transitioned into just the regular English social studies department, and then because of where I went to college, they wanted me to teach the honors kids. And so, that experience was a little bit different than teaching new immigrants who had potentially just arrived and are 9th and 10th graders, and they have to graduate in a few years, and they just need to learn the English language, which conversely they can learn in a couple of years. But to be academic, they need to have like 7 to 10 years before they really become academic in the English language, and they only have 3 or 4 before they get to graduate. So that was always an interesting experience for me. The teaching and the administration and the superintendencies in Elizabeth and then in Passaic were really good fits for me, because the population of kids, first of all, Elizabeth was my hometown, so I knew it, although the demographics of the Hispanic population started to change, right? When I was there, it was largely Puerto Rican and Cuban, but by the time I got there, and it was 4 years later, and by the time I ended my 22 and a half years of teaching to superintendent there before I transitioned to Passaic, the Hispanic population really had shifted over to Central South Americans and Dominican Americans. So it was shifting. When I landed in Passaic again, the demographics were different. So in Elizabeth, it was about 70% Hispanic, about 20% African American Black, about just under 10% white, and then the remainder of the group. Passaic, smaller community, about 25,000 students in Elizabeth, 15,000 in Passaic, 2 of the largest districts in New Jersey. Their demographics are like 90% Hispanic and about 4% Black, 1% I think white, and then like 2% Asian. But that group was largely Indian population. So it became really much more Hispanic and many more immigrants, and a lot more Spanish speaking, and the need for a lot more bilingual teachers. But both communities were a really good fit for me because I can relate to the children and I can relate to the parents because my parents were them, right? my parents not knowing English, right, and having an 8th grade and a 6th grade education in their home country of Puerto Rico, right? So you can see the level of education they had in their own targeted language. So my personal history, I would convey it. I certainly, when I became superintendent, one of the things I did learn at the Broad Academy was to structure a leadership story, because as I went on listening and learning tours in both communities on my entry plan, people need to get to know you, right? And when I teach my classes at Lehigh, a different population of students, but my first session, I always share my leadership story and then have them share it, because the nature of my class is largely this discussion, and I need them to feel comfortable with their peers and be vulnerable enough to share their opinions in class. That's at the college level. But when I was being superintendent, a classroom teacher, or as administrator, conveying my story to the community, I felt was always important, because they could see that the possibilities for their own children, and then the students could see the possibilities for themselves, seeing a one generation removed, actually 2 generations removed, right? My grandparents couldn't write or read in their native language of Spanish. And I really only knew my maternal grandmother, Cecilia. But I discovered later on, I was filling out some forms for her, and she couldn't sign her name. All she can do is put down an X. So the stories was like that I share with you is critically important, that I conveyed it. Probably when I was a teacher, I didn't convey it in this little window. It was probably something that unfolded over the school year. And then when I was superintendent, I would repeat the story at different venues, right? Because you would be meeting the community members, you'd be meeting parents, you'd meet other administrators. When I landed in Passaic, I had no political or personal capital, because I was a new person. Elizabeth, I had a lot of relationships just from being a student and an athlete going in, and then being a teacher and administrator before I came as superintendent. I had a lot of political capital. But it's interesting, because in my hometown of Maplewood, the school district is the South Orange Maplewood School District. So the 2 towns join together and have one school district. And they've had some turnover in the superintendency. And at one point, the first turnover, my daughters were in the car, and they were young enough. And they go, "Dad, why don't you apply for that job?" Why don't you drive? So Maplewood's a suburban town, and not many Hispanics here. And why don't you apply for that job? Is right. You'll be right home. You can just kind of roll out of bed. And I start chuckling. I go, "Listen, girls, it's just not a good match for me. The board dynamics in my urban centers were a certain thing that I understood, and I knew how to navigate the politics of that. The suburban politics were not unions and politicians. It was like parents."
Mhm.
And like education is the only industry that everyone else thinks they can tell the professionals what to do, right? Like, you don't go to a doctor or the architect, right? Or even your plumber and tell them, "I think you should do this," right? But they're the professional, you hire them, right? But everybody's been to school, so they all have opinions of it. So I said to my child, "No, I don't think I want to work in this community." And I knew the superintendent at the time, what he was going through, and I said, it's just not a right fit for me. But even when I transitioned to Passaic, I did my due diligence, in the sense that, is that going to be a right fit? I mean, the demographics seemed okay, but then I had to think about the elected officials, the board members, the mayor, the assemblyman, the unions. What are the dynamics? Is the board sane? Or are they going
Right.
to, are you going to drive? I mean, you're always going to have some board members, and if you're there long enough, like I was, 8.5 years and 7.5 years, the board that hires you is not the board when I left. Every year there's an election, so
Right.
there's changeover. So, uh, So I guess those are the kind of things that come to mind when you
Yeah.
ask the question. I don't know if I hit all the pieces that
No,
you
that
asked.
makes sense.
Hi, listeners. I'm sorry, but we experienced a short blip in Matt's audio and missed the question that led into Pablo's next part of the conversation. Apologize for the inconvenience, and please continue to enjoy the conversation.
Yeah, you might have to remind me of the questions as we go along. Yeah, the teacher population in the pipeline in Elizabeth, and less so in Passaic. I'm not remembering the data so much, but the administration and the teaching staff was more aligned with kind of the American teacher, right? You think of the pipeline of who can become a teacher, right? You need to have a college education, and then you need to get certified and either do the student teaching or do alternate route. And people like me, Hispanics or Latino or Latinx, whatever you like to call yourself, I generally just say I'm Puerto Rican. We're not going to college at the same volume as our white peers, right? So now the pipeline is smaller, and then and then do they graduate? Yeah, if they do graduate, what's their choice, right? Can I go and get a job that may pay me a little bit more? I may be happy, I may not be happy. Or do I go back and become a teacher? And there's a lot of joy in that if you actually like to teach kids, right? And I ended up loving it. And now that I'm teaching college, I'm loving life all over again because I'm not dealing with all the nuances and the annoyances of leading a school district. But yeah, the teaching staff was very in the bilingual program was very Hispanic, right? Because you needed to be a Spanish speaker. And we did have a population of kids that were Haitian Creole speakers, so we had some of those teachers. But for the most part, both bilingual programs in Passaic and Elizabeth were Spanish speakers. So you tend to have larger numbers of Hispanic teachers represented just because you need Spanish speakers. All those bilingual kids, whether they're Spanish speakers or another native language, are all getting ESL. So that can come from any type of teacher. And I was pleasantly surprised. I was really surprised when I landed in Passaic because they had a lot of Hispanic administrators. Not so true in Elizabeth, and that goes back to the history, right? And so the pipeline, right? When I was in school, the Puerto Ricans, the Cubans was I don't even know the percentages because I wasn't privy to it when I was 18 years old. But by the time I was going through school, it was largely Hispanic, Italian, Irish communities, Puerto Rican, Cubans. I think there's a pocket of a Polish community in Passaic, in Elizabeth when I was growing up. So that ended up being kind of the demographic. Some holdover generational whites historically, like some of them even going back to colonial time, given that Elizabeth was one of those colonial towns. So yeah, the pipeline was full in the administrative ranks and the teaching ranks because it takes so long for folks to eventually retire and create vacancies, largely with white teachers. But that seems to be the case in most of America, that the students, especially in urban centers, and then especially if they're highly segregated, right? De facto segregation, because schools by state rules are designed by, at least in New Jersey, by their town borders, and then you can't cross over to the next town and go to school. So yeah, the teachers were not like me, right? The vast majority of them. So when I became an administrator it wasn't something that I really looked at or cared about, right? Because my attention was, what academic task are you putting in front of the kids? So when I was a supervisor, I was evaluating the quality of teaching. And then when I became a superintendent, I had broad leadership responsibility and setting the vision and the mission for the district and articulating that all the time, and then creating my personal theory of action and making and executing that. It all funneled down to making sure kids were getting high level academic rigorous content put before them, and making sure the evaluation feedback system to the adults from wherever they came from was focused on that. So I never really paid too much attention to the demographics of the teachers when I became an administrator. It was probably something more in my mind when I was a teacher, thinking about being a role model. So I don't know if that,
So,
hopefully
so
that
to
answers
speak,
some of that question.
definitely, and speaking to what you were saying about transitioning into your role as a superintendent and setting that vision, uh, a large majority of our audience listening, I know we have a lot of administrators, I would say more building administrators, and a lot of teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And so from your perspective as a superintendent for a long period of time, and the longer I've been in education, and even taking leadership classes myself for that certification, learning more about the position of superintendents and how short the average superintendency actually is. So the fact that you were 8 years and 7 years in two different districts is well beyond the average of what you see from superintendents, which speaks to your leadership and your success. So it's so easy for teachers to feel disconnected from what the superintendent is doing to what they are doing in the classroom. And you spoke specifically to the rigorous academic activities that students are participating in. So if I had the opportunity to talk to a couple of teachers or a couple of building administrators in your districts about how you supported their growth and the growth of the students, what would you say were some key visionary ideas or key strategies or systems that you put into place that you feel had a strong positive impact on the rigor of the academics in a daily classroom activity?
Yeah, so that's interesting. If you spoke to teachers, I mean, you'll probably get a wide range of answers about who Pablo Munoz was, right? Because jokingly, now and then you touched on it. I like to say I'm a unicorn because I was a superintendent for 8.5 years and 7.5 years. I was Puerto Rican on top of that, and I was working in an inner city, which in Elizabeth, there was a political battle that I described in chapter 7 of my book that was blood sport. It was just brutal. And Passaic, the politics were all kind of aligned. The mayor, the assemblyman, the city council, and the board. So there was less drama in Passaic, but that doesn't mean I didn't have to navigate the politics. So actually, in one of my chapters, I have a 2x2 matrix where I have a student achievement on the x-axis and politics on the y-axis, and I have 4 quadrants, and I talk about how a superintendent has to navigate those quadrants to get students academically successful, and also to navigate the politics in order to be around to actually be the leader that executes that. But to your larger question, really, it speaks to the heart and the soul of my book, right? So the title of the book is called The Leader's Algorithm. And so I'll start answering that question by kind of talking about the leader's algorithm. Then I'll move into the personal theory of action. And that really gets at some of the questions that you talk about, because as a superintendent, I have to kind of set vision and mission and talk about it, write about it, and actually act it at all times. But then I have to put systems in place that ultimately cascade down into the classroom, right? So the title of the book is The Leader's Algorithm, but it's also in chapter 1 as an equation. So let me first talk about the book title. And so the book is largely a book on educational leadership. I wrote The Leader's Algorithm. If I had to choose one word, it would be help. So I wrote it to help aspiring, new, and current school administrators. And the vision for the book was to share what I learned in my 30-year journey in public education, 16 years of that as superintendent of schools. I wanted to share what I had learned from my advocates and my mentors. I wanted to share what I learned from the Broad Academy. And then I also wanted to share what I learned from what I called my book mentors, all the books and case studies that I read about leadership and management and teaching and learning from people I mostly never met. And then the second hope for the book was that aspiring, new, and current administrators will actually get the book, read it, and use it to create their leadership framework to lead and manage their schools. So that's kind of the essence of the book and the title. But what is the leader's algorithm once you get into chapter 1? It's really a simple equation that puts strategic thinking to work. So what you do is write a personal theory of action, and you share that personal theory of action publicly. Then you execute it. You don't keep it a theory, you actually execute it consistently with public accountability. And if you do that, then you will transform your life, work, schools, school districts, and relationships. So said simply, the equation is a personal theory of action plus execution plus accountability equals transformation. And that brings me to the point of what you were asking about and how that plays out in my leadership. The heart and soul of the book is the personal theory of action. In the first chapter, I teach you what it is, and I teach you how to write one. And then the rest of the book kind of talks about all the principles that played out in my theory of action, teaches leadership principles through my personal and professional stories. But let me tell the audience what a personal theory of action is, and then I can give some examples of how it plays out in actuality as I lead. So a personal theory of action is, in its basic form, a written leadership framework. Personal theory of action is largely a hypothesis of what you can personally do and through your team to achieve your goals. It's written in a logical if-then statements that lead to your ultimate goal. And usually your ultimate goal is your mission statement, or you're paraphrasing your mission statement. Said another way, if we do A, B, and C, then we will get X, Y, and Z results. So my personal theory of action was my leadership framework that I used, my leadership framework and strategy that I used to lead and manage the Elizabeth and Passaic public schools. And when you get the book, my personal theory of action, the one that I wrote in Passaic and Elizabeth, my final two versions are in Appendix A, and you can read exactly what's in there. But my personal theory of action was broken down into 4 if statements. The first one was, if I do certain things. The second if statement was about what my leadership team would do and what I expected of them. The third thing was the expectations of how I was going to redesign the organization. And interesting enough, that part of my personal theory of action also became the organizational theory of action, which in both school districts, I got the board to adopt a board policy for an organizational theory of action. The fourth if statement are the guiding principles for the organization. And then the last is the then statement, which I said before is the ultimate goal, and usually paraphrasing the mission statement. So I'll give you an example of the first if statement is exactly what I would try to be doing at all times, right? Because there's a lot of noise in public education, and especially when you're a superintendent, you can get pulled in many different directions by your 9 board members, by your mayor, by your assemblyman, by the teachers union, by parents, whoever is in the organization, right? And but I decided, given all the things I can focus in on, that I would focus in on 3 things. And so the statement reads like this: if I lead with a focus on 3 items, the first one is keep the system focused on its vision and mission in an effort to produce excellent results. Number 2 was select effective leaders to carry out the mission. And the third thing was to get the resources into the classroom. So back to your original question, if you were to ask teachers about Pablo Munoz, I think they would all be able to say that Pablo did these things. They probably might not be able to give you word for word, but what I believed about leadership was my written word, my spoken word, and my actions always had to match, right? It led to the credibility that I would have, right? Because for the most part, I'm many layers removed from the classroom. So teachers are really getting my message either in written form or spoken form, either if I was speaking to them as a group or there was a recording, the written word, if I sent an email or a memo. But it's always usually getting translated. What I believe and what I want to occur is usually getting translated by principals and assistant principals and supervisors of instruction back at the schools. So a lot of my messaging was to the leadership so that they were the ones that are actually communicating to the classroom teacher. So if you were speaking to them, they would probably say, Pablo was a pretty quiet guy. I'm an introvert. And he was laser focused on improving student achievement. And what I use as the guiding principles for that, which I talked about a little bit earlier, the third if statement was the organizational theory of action. And I got the board to adopt a policy that was called an aligned instructional system, and it had 7 major variables. And I'll just give you shorthand. The first one was curriculum. The second one was developing effective teachers and leaders. The third one was comprehensive professional development system. The fourth thing was formative and summative assessments. The fifth was building a comprehensive student information system. Number 6 was establishing interventions. And the third one was measuring performance, progress, and growth. So in my personal theory of action is just some short sentences, right? My personal theory of action fits on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper on one side, but a policy usually is a little bit longer. So those 7 things in a policy that was probably 3 or 5 pages long had a preamble, and it had some statements that the board wanted to make about why they have a personal theory of action. But then these things get fleshed out a little more detail. And what the policy does is tell the superintendent, go design the school district based on this policy. So the interesting thing is that I wrote the policy, and then I had convinced the board to adopt it, which ultimately ended up giving me strength as a superintendent to go execute board policy. But it's what I wanted to do anyway. And it was part of my personal theory of action, plus it was part of the organizational theory of action of the school district in a policy. Now, to your broader question is, then those 7 things get built out over time, right? It doesn't happen in a day, right? 8.5 years in Elizabeth, 7.5 years in Passaic, they're still building it out. I'm there no longer. If they want to see continued success, then the board has to hire effective superintendents that hire effective administrators that can continue to carry out what the board wants. if they change directions and they become transactional political, a lot of this stuff can come tumbling down in a second. But building out the systems take a whole lot of time. So how would a teacher be affected by this? They would start getting new curriculum, right? And they would start getting new professional development, right? And then they would be doing formative assessments on a periodic basis that they were reporting back to the central office, because our design was would have kind of benchmarking assessments that were common throughout the district, so that we can see how the kids are doing regardless of what schools they were. So they would see that. They would be seeing a lot more professional development, the teachers, on teaching strategies, pedagogy, but also content, right? And then when we started to move the district into more rigorous content, and I'll give you the example. In Passaic, we had an equity goal. And the equity goal was that students would graduate from the Passaic Public Schools with either a career certification, 15 college credits, or both. So that was the written statement. That was the statement we articulated. And we used that statement to create partnership with local colleges to expand our advanced placement offerings. And in both cases, since they had to teach more rigorous content, we had to send teachers out for professional development, especially on the advanced placement stuff. On the college courses stuff, sometimes it was the college professors that taught our students, so we sent them to the college, but oftentimes the high school teacher became an adjunct if they met the qualifications of the local college. So they didn't necessarily need any additional training unless it was an AP class that was equivalent, that was accounting towards the college. But I had a bigger dream, right? And so you take these dreams in phases. So I never memorialized it in writing, but I would talk about it all the time. And then I would talk to the principals. I would have one-on-ones with them, and I would visit them, bring them to my office, and say, listen, this is my bigger vision. I want kids to graduate with a high school diploma and an associate's degree. So in 2021, the first, I think 12 or 13 kids did graduate from one of my Passaic high schools with a high school diploma and associate's degree. And then the following year, in 2022, I think it went up to 30, doubled. And I have since stopped keeping track. And I wasn't even there because I retired in April of 2021. And that first graduating class was in June. So I didn't even get to shake their hands. But it's stuff like that. So that's how the teachers start to feel it, right? You first pass policy to establish attendance requirements for students, promotion retention requirements, new high school graduation policies. Then when you design these new schools, because I broke the high school into three different high schools with three different themes, you end up creating policies on how kids get into and apply to the different schools. And then really you spend the rest of your time on a 5-year rotation of redesigning curriculum. And then once you redesign curriculum, you have to take into account the professional development that the teachers need. So the teachers, if they felt anything directly from Pablo Munoz's time there, is a lot of change in content and a lot of professional development to teach that content.
So as far as the student achievement aspect, that's a conversation that I think my opinion has changed on over the last few years. So I taught fifth grade for a long time. I was an elementary STEM teacher for only 1 year, and I'm now a secondary instructional coach. And so I support our high school and our 3 middle schools. And most of my day is spent working with teachers in classrooms, but I'm also sitting in planning and brainstorming meetings with principals, with curriculum supervisors, and with our assistant superintendents. And so as a classroom teacher, student achievement was not on my radar that much in terms of state achievement. Now, part of that was my students, for the most part, did pretty well. My personal rating scores were good. So maybe that was part of not my entire focus. I don't think the message was was coming down to me too much. And as I'm in this instructional coach role, my goal is to support teachers, support their confidence, support the activities that they're doing in the classrooms, and creating engaging activities for students where they're not just consuming content, but they're becoming active participants in the classroom. But looking at particular grade levels, particular subject areas is a part of my job in supporting the administrators to increase student achievement. And so uh, it's become a part of what I'm doing, and I'm actually enjoying it because I'm pushing the idea of professional development being so important. I'm pushing the idea of sound instruction being a part of the plan, not just looking for where's the resource, where's the fix, where's the band-aid that we can put on to raise these scores for this particular subject area. So from your perspective and experience, what is one or two key aspects that you think is vital in helping improve and increase student achievement, as it is ranked, with state testing and those public measures?
So another wonderful question. Let me start with some background first. I think you all, I think your listeners will know this, and you will know this. Love it or hate it, when No Child Left Behind came around, and then was followed by the next new title, I think, Every Student Succeeds Act, which is all the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. What that ended up doing, at least in the urban centers, right? Because it was very easy in the urban centers to highlight your successes, right? Because there wasn't a whole lot of accountability for the non-successful kids, right? But when No Child Left Behind came along, whether you liked it or disliked it, what it did was put a big spotlight on all students, right? And measuring the results by demographic groups, right? Boys, girls, and different ethnic groups. And so this kind of played out, since I lived in the suburbs and knew some suburban superintendents, that some of their secrets were being displayed, right? Especially if they had some low, probably they had low income, which may have also been related to an ethnic group or racial or ethnic identity group. They were so high achieving overall; those students could be hidden. In the inner city, for the most part, when I inherited Elizabeth and Passaic was in much worse shape academically than Elizabeth. You know, for the most part, most of our kids are not achieving, right? So you're designing the system for the totality of the kids. I mean, we could break down the subgroups and see who's trailing and where the achievement gaps are. But for the most part, I used to look at my work on a macro level and a micro level. On the macro level, I used to look at the Elizabeth Public Schools and the Passaic Public Schools are part of the United States of America, and therefore I need to design a school system for my kids to compete against all American kids, right? For the best schools, the best colleges, and therefore I had to design a school system over time to make that happen. On the micro level, I have varying performances of kids, right? And I have new kids to the country, and I have large groups of English language learners. So some of the issues that my peers in other communities did not have to deal with, I deal in large numbers. So that's kind of the background that I'm working in. So the two major things, I mean, we could spend a whole lot of time, and I spell out a lot of this in the book. So those that get a chance to read it can see the progression of the 16 years as a superintendent play out in the book. But if I had to give people two things to work on, it would be one, policy, right? You have to be declarative in board policy what you expect, right? So something as simple as a high school graduation policy, both in Elizabeth and Passaic, in the state of New Jersey, they only required 120 credits. So I'm not even going to get into defining that. It's just make believe it's an index number. It's 120 credits.
Right.
What I did in the high school graduation policy is increase the number of credits kids had to take to graduate from my high schools in Elizabeth and Passaic. And by doing that, for the most part, I raised it in Passaic to 150 credits and in Elizabeth 160 credits. Kids were getting, they needed to take 5 years of school in 4 years, right? When you compare it to 120 credits. The 120 credits was a 4-year graduation, but I added another 30 or another 40 credits on it. So it was really, I was getting kids because my kids need it, right? They're trailing, right? You look at studies and kids graduating from suburbs with a 12th grade education. Our kids are graduating at an 8th grade level, right? So when I had them, I needed to give them more instruction. So I increased the number of credits, and then I needed to work on the quality of instruction through professional development and evaluations and feedback and the hiring of effective people. So policy is critically important, right? And then there was, and in the book, I touch on some very critical student policies that help move academic achievement ahead, right? Because you can create a very low level standard and or you can raise the bar, right? And I asked the board to raise the bar through policy. So policy would be the first thing. Is if you're a superintendent, work with your board to create policies that set the groundwork for what you want the school district to become, right? So it'll take time to get there, but you need to define it. And then the second thing, and it's the most important thing, and actually, when I landed in Passaic, when I was doing my listening tour, and this actually was a soft landing, I hadn't even started yet. So I went to visit 1 or 2 days, and I'm just laughing now. I mean, I'm not the superintendent, but they know I'm going to be the superintendent, and I tour the school and I sit down and I ask them one question. I go, "How do you improve teaching and learning?" It's like I'm not even there yet, right? But I'm there. And they don't know, they give me tons of answers, but they don't give me the answer I'm looking for, right? And the answer is it's a very simple answer, and it's an answer that I ended up discovering from Liz City and Richard Elmore's work in instructional rounds in education, which had a profound effect on me as a superintendent. The answer is you have to improve the instructional core. So you asked me for advice, I would say focus on the instructional core. And so, Pablo, what the heck is the instructional core? The instructional core is the relationship between the teacher, the student, and the content, which usually occurs in the classroom, right? And you have to work on those 3 things at all times. And they all come together around cognitively challenging tasks. So if I were to tell people and answer your question, the subset of that is if you could do only one thing, put cognitively challenging tasks in front of children. And they will get challenged, and some of them will get frustrated, and some of them won't do as well. But then we set up a whole support system to get them up to speed. But when you read that work, the instructional rounds in education, they have 7 principles that go with the instructional core. I don't remember all 7 of them. I only remember 2 of them, and because I could only focus on so many things, and so many things I want to keep on repeating. These were the things that I would repeat. I actually only repeated 1 of them most of the time. The first one is if you work on one element of the core, right? If you work on teachers, which would be pedagogy or content skills, then you also need to work on the other 2, which is student engagement, and content, which is rigor and the level of rigor. So that was profound. Sounds simple, was profound. And I actually, when I was a supervisor of social studies, screwed that up royally, right? So in 2008 and 9, when I discovered this work, it was like, oh, duh, you should have known this, right? When I was a supervisor of social studies, I said, oh, let me buy new textbooks in social studies and the whole world will be a much better place. And I forgot the whole element of giving them professional development on the content, right? But I didn't know that then. And over time, I learned more and more by reading and from other and being in the Broad Academy and just trial and error. And this book came out and it kind of changed my life as far as I was thinking as a superintendent, dealing with all this other stuff, but I needed to focus on teaching and learning. And how can I convey that? Which is focus on the instructional core, the 3 elements. And if you work on one of them, you got to work on the other 2. But the most important thing, which I would repeat at all times, right? I didn't really talk that much about the one I just talked about. I did that for you in the audience. But the one I would repeat all the time and put on my PowerPoint presentations at budget season is task predicts performance. Task predicts performance. That's it, right? If you're a superintendent and you want to improve academic performance, focus on the assignments kids actually do. Right?
Yes.
And make sure they are cognitively challenging tasks, right? And you can start doing that by policy and then defining your program of studies and then defining what the program of study looks in scope and sequence and then what the scope and sequence looks in a particular curriculum and then so on and so forth, right? As you get more granular, right? But task predicts performance. And I would talk about that with the administrative staff. And if I had teachers in front of me, I'd talk about it. Not so much with the custodial staff or the security staff, although that's probably the group that I got along with the best, and maybe not with parents, right? Because I probably needed to say it a different way. But those would be the 2 things, right? You need to make sure policies are in place that support the vision of higher academic expectations and rigorous content for the kids. And then when you actually do the work, it all stems from, right? The instructional core sits right at the center of the environment that you work in, which is in public education is a political system. Public education sits right in the center of it. And if you're going to start working on improving your school district, you have to improve the instructional core and making sure that kids are getting cognitively challenging academic tasks at all times. So it doesn't matter what the teacher writes in our lesson plan. It actually doesn't even matter the instructions the teacher gives. It's actually what the execution of the assignment that the kid does actually will predict how they will perform later on, either on formative assessment, summative assessment, the SAT, the AP exam. So that's what I would say.
It makes complete sense, and it's such a simple way to think about it. You could use the analogy of games aren't won on the field; they're won in the weight room or the practice field, right? Those tasks predict performance on the stage that everybody sees. All of those layers build towards that, and I think that it's something that teachers can take and they can change tomorrow, right? You can look at the activity that your students are doing and just ask, are these higher level thinking questions? Look at the questions that they're doing and compare it to the state standards and the eligible content available for those standards. And do your questions look as hard as what they're being expected to ask? I so often hear teachers say, and I was one of them, the questions on the state tests, so for Pennsylvania, it's PSSAs, it's Keystones, are so much more complicated and they're so wordy and they're so lengthy and they're so much different than what we ask in the classroom. Well, those aren't changing, right? So change what you're asking in the classroom. Increase the rigor of your questions. Increase the complexity, like you're saying, of those questions in the classroom, so that the students are prepared for it. Yes, they're going to struggle. Yes, you're going to have to scaffold. Yes, you're going to have to use those instructional strategies to support them, but they need to be exposed and they need to have that opportunity to struggle or to prove to you that they can do it. And the more they're exposed, the more they'll be able to do it. The first couple lessons, when you're changing and you're increasing the rigor, are going to be more difficult, but the students will get used to that and will develop skills to be able to continue to solve that. So I want to jump into our exit ticket, which is the same 4 questions we ask every guest every week. Just to wrap our conversation up here, and also it'll give you more opportunities to share about how the audience can connect with you as well. So question number 1, what is the best thing a teacher can do to make a student's school experience better?
So I have 2. right? And I'm probably beating this drum. I'm starting where I just ended, right? Uh, provide students cognitively challenging tasks. That's how you make the experience better. And then the second thing is, and my 8th chapter is called Leading with Love, is to love your students like you love your own children. And what I mean by that is universal love, which is being selfless, unconditional, compassionate, and having empathy. And then enduring love, right? Commitment, patience, and tolerance. So if you can combine the two, rigorous, cognitively challenging tasks with uh, loving your students and all those words I just said about it, then ultimately, the students are smart. I actually say this in my book. They know when you care about them, and they can feel if you care about them, and they also know by the assignments you give them if you care about them, right?
I think that's a
So that's
really
what I would say.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think we as educators really struggle with that balance. You know, to say that we love our kids, scaffolding and being the liaison between that challenging cognitive work and what the kids are actually performing. We want to be that buffer that shows that we care and support. And sometimes we overfill and provide too much support that they don't actually receive their on grade level task. And that's just us masking our care from ever giving them the full exposure of what they really need. So just an interesting thing that I think you brought up. The next question really I am excited to hear your answer is just what is the best piece of advice that you've received, and it may have come from a colleague, a supervisor, or even a student?
Yeah, wonderful question. Actually came from mom and dad, and it wasn't even a verbal piece of advice. So I'll give you the advice, but it was advice that I experienced and saw. I put words to it. So the advice is listen and learn with your eyes and your heart more than with your ears.
Wow.
Love that.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And the corollary to that is I was having a meeting once with some administrators in Passaic. I'm in Elizabeth, sorry. And one of my administrators was, I think, a deacon in his church, and he gave a quote by Saint Francis of Assisi. It was the first time I heard it. I said, "Oh, wow, that's powerful," and I actually included it. I think I included it in my book, but it is framed. Actually, I'm not sure if it's in the book, but it goes like this: Go out and preach the gospel, and if you must, use words. And I was like, oh man, you sit there for a second, you process it, and you go, oh, I got it. Deeds, right? Deeds, right? Right? It's like that one saying, I forget who it's attributed to. I said, I can't hear what you're saying because your actions are screaming so loudly in my ears, right? So what I learned from my parents, right, that I said initially, listen and learn more with your eyes and your heart than with your ears. For me, as when I was leading, it was critically important that I modeled what I wrote, spoke, and acted. And then when I judged people, I would listen to them, right? Because you have to, and you get a lot of information, but you also have to trust your heart and your eyes and your gut when you're leading. And sometimes, the words aren't matching with what should be happening. So What's happening is what's important. Be careful what people are whispering, because sometimes they're trying to take you in a different direction.
Love it. So this one I'm going to challenge you a little bit. I'm sure you'll rise to the occasion. We recognize that the school year really has different waves to it. Times are going well, like right now. Last week report cards are done. I feel like, a big weight is off my shoulders as we move into the holiday season when we're recording this. But there are also definite times where we as educators struggle to survive. What is something you feel like you should, use the platform to express to people to help them power up through those moments of struggle?
Yeah, that's a tough question. That's a hard one. I would say two things. As a teacher, as an educator, wherever you are in the system, right? Everyone in the system matters, right? Custodians, security guards, food service workers, teachers, administrators, they all matter because they all have an important part in delivering services to kids. I would say two things. First, you have the power to improve the lives of children. So when you're struggling, remember that in your hands, in your mind, in your heart, you have the power to improve the lives of these children. And that was especially true in my settings, right? I had two urban districts, 86% and 88% poverty rates, right? A lot of poverty. So education was the major vehicle for them to move themselves out of that level of poverty and to kind of fulfill the American dream. The second thing I would say is what you teach and what students learn will ultimately shape the future of our country. So those are two things I would say when you're struggling, right? Remember that you improve the lives of children, and everything that you do with these children will ultimately shape the future of our country.
That's great. It's easy to fall into facilitating a repetitive classroom. What do you think separates the teachers who are the ones constantly seeking to change, innovate, and adopt new teaching strategies?
Yeah, so this is a challenging question in the sense that, we don't always have to innovate, right? Like I've said, the stuff we do isn't brain surgery. So some of the stuff that's, like I talked about, the instructional core is not new information, but not many people reflect on that, especially as leaders or superintendent, right? Maybe some of your staff that are in graduate school are reading it and all of a sudden they're excited by it. But what I would say is, teachers need to reflect. The more effective teacher, the teachers that really do a good job in the class and change and innovate and adopt new teaching strategies, they're very reflective, and they're very reflective about what they're teaching, and they're very reflective about the classroom experiences. And like one of my book mentors says, that experience isn't the best teacher, it's evaluated experience that's the best teacher, right? So the best teachers are generally thinking about what just happened in the classroom and being reflective about it and saying what worked and what didn't work. And then they're asking themselves, I think, three questions. One, what do my students need? Two, how can I challenge my students cognitively? And then three, how do I show my students unconditional love and compassion? That would be my answer.
I can speak for Ken and myself, and I'm sure our audience, and say that we've enjoyed just having the opportunity to listen to what was an intro that laid the groundwork for really strong and meaningful forward steps you had through your career, and as it continues. How can our audience continue to learn from you, connect with you, and possibly continuing to listen to your story?
Yeah, listen, I would love for them to get the book and read the book, because I think when you read it, it's a pretty fascinating book. My intention of the book, I've read a lot of leadership books, both for educational leadership and for the business world, leadership and management. And I think there's a level of uniqueness in my book, in the sense that I share my wins and losses, right? When you read chapter 7, the title is Leading with Resilience. I talk about the political blood sport in Elizabeth, and then I talk about my anxiety, my depression, and how that event actually I have to go to hospital. I went to an inpatient stay for 2 weeks because I was and I had a major depressive episode while I was the superintendent, right? So I think if you read the book, you'll see how raw and vulnerable I get, and kind of share with you leadership principles, but also share with you that I don't always win, and I share my losses, and I share my darkest moments in there. So if they pick up the book, I think they'll find it as a good resource. If they're thinking about leading, it'll give them a sense of how to create a personal theory of action. And then as they go through the book, they'll see all the different lessons I teach, and some wins, and some are lessons of victories, and some are lessons of losses. And you learn from both, and you often learn the most from your losses. The second thing, they can visit my website, themunozcompany.com, and they can see the resources that I provide as an educational leadership consultant. On that site, there's some free downloads that they can get. I also have a page there that describes my book. They can log on there and get a free chapter if they want before they buy the book. There's a number of podcasts on the website now, so you can get, if you don't get the book and you want to listen to more of Pablo Munoz talk about educational leadership and life as a superintendent, there's a number of different podcasts there that have taken different directions, right? Because each interviewer has a different perspective. My email address is pablo@themunozcompany.com, so people can email me there. I'm also on LinkedIn as Pablo Munoz. So listen, any of your listeners, I would love to talk to any of them. Actually, some gentleman from Boston took me up on it, and he found me on LinkedIn and sent me a message. Can we talk? I just listened to your podcast, and you said you'd talk to anybody. So I did. And he told me kind of his main gist, and then I had prepared for him, and we talked for like an hour and a half. And he was just graduating, and he was thinking about what he wanted to do. And so if I'm at that point in my life, right, I retired from public education, I'm an adjunct professor, consultant, author. I'm at the point in my life where I want to give back and help people. Quite frankly, that's been my whole existence. I was just helping students. But now, if I can help adults become better leaders, if I can help adults get through the dark times, because I've been through them, if they're struggling, right? And no one likes to talk about mental illness, right? If you break your arm, whoa, oh, I'm so sorry, I feel better, right? But if you have anxiety, depression, it's still a taboo. So in the book, I'm trying to do my part to break that down. So I'd be happy to talk to anybody. Email me or send me a message on LinkedIn. My telephone number is on the website as well, so you can always call me. But be happy to speak to any of your guests and chat about whatever they need.
Well, thank you so much, Pablo. We will link up to your website, your book, wherever you're watching or listening. You can scroll down and click on that, or visit our website at powereduup.com, and you can check it all there out as well. So seriously, I greatly appreciate your time. I greatly appreciate the advice, the conversation, the ideas that you proposed to us, and it is very evident why you were so integral and so important to the districts you worked in for so many years. And I'm just happy to hear that you are continuing your role in supporting education through, especially through that adjunct position, as well as your consulting and your book to just help steer educators in the right way. I think we need more of individuals like you that have lived it and breathed it for so long to continue to support the next generation of educators and leaders. So Pablo, thank you again for joining us. And Matt, why don't you take us on out of here?
All right, as we power down this episode, Pablo, you have definitely left us feeling powered up. So thank you for your time. And for our audience,
Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe on whichever platform you're listening to or watching us on YouTube. Each week, we get to talk to amazing educators who are making a positive impact on the lives of students, their colleagues, administrators, and education as a whole. It's been such a privilege every week to be able to talk to these incredible individuals, learn from them, grow with them, and better myself and all of education through these conversations. If you haven't already, please consider sharing this with a colleague, someone who can benefit and be powered up from the experience of listening to these incredible conversations. Because of Powered Up, we are powering education by empowering you.